okay, that's fine. That's what it means. That's always what that means. This one could clear the room, but Coke or Pepsi?
Ooh, I know the correct answer around here is Coke.
Okay. That's good. I wanted to make sure this interview could go on. How about Waffle House or IHOP?
And I'm from more Cracker Barrel country.
Okay, great. My mom loves Cracker Barrel. That's perfect. You had the right answer in my heart, so that's good. Do you say you all or y'all?
You all. It's kind of
so if you see a group of people, what do you say?
Yeah, not quite y'all.
Okay, you're not y'all yet.
But it's not necessarily you all. Like there's going to be some, we're going to marry the two of them.
Okay. Perfect. And then, most importantly to me, I got two more. So, who's your favorite Ninja Turtle? It's important. Which one represents you the best?
Leonardo's the kind of grumpy one. Right?
Is that you?
The blue one, is it?
I don't know how to. Yes, Leonardo's the blue one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he's more my
the grumpy guy. But he's the leader. He's the leader of the.
Yeah, he's got kind of quiet, kind of dignified leadership, right?
There you go. That's awesome. And then last question is Beyonce or Sasha Fierce?
Oh.
This is tough.
Gotta be Team Beyonce there.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Beyonce always wins, right? So I wanted to kick off about just kind of one question we always ask in Atlanta that's important as we're drinking sweet tea together is why do you do what you do? Not what you do. You chose to take a life in public service, but why? Why was that the path that you chose?
So the main thing is I need to work on things that I believe matter. I remember having a moment. I used to work in business. I liked it. Good colleagues, good pay, interesting stuff. But at one point I became an expert on grocery prices. And I mean, nobody knew more than I did about how to crunch and slice and dice grocery prices. And I cared about doing a good job for my client and for my boss and my coworkers. But I remember sitting in a room with a computer. I got up to get a cup of coffee, and I just thought, I don't care. I care about doing a good job, but I don't care that like this company is going to do better than that company. And I began to realize that I needed the propulsion of knowing that what I worked on was going to matter, whether anybody was paying me to work on it or not. And when I was a student studying politics, I always thought all the interesting stuff was national and then international. Yeah. And what I never would have guessed is how much meaning there would have been from going home and working on something local. But at a time when my city was really struggling, at the beginning of this decade, we were showing up on lists of dying cities. There was a kind of crisis of confidence in our community. But I believed in our city. I cared about our city as my home. And I discovered that there were things as challenging and as exotic a mile away from my own boyhood home as there were, that I could find traveling around the world, and that there was going to be adventure in serving and making myself useful in my own backyard. That's how I wound up becoming mayor.
And who was influential for you in that journey? A lot of my journey comes from my parents are immigrants. They came to the United States, built a business. That was their journey, and that's had a huge influence on how I view the world.
Yeah.
Who was that for you?
Yeah, there's no question that my parents played a similar role. My father came to this country in the 70s, decided to become a citizen, met my mother. I don't think they knew that they would be in South Bend for long. They moved there for a job, and then...
That is the immigrant destination, I guess? What
is it?
It ought to be,
right? It ought to be.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure it was true in 1980. But anyway, they found their way there. And I think they had always a little more relationship to the place than they wanted to admit, actually. But the other thing that was very influential was people my age who I had grown up with who dispersed. Because in a place like South Bend, we grew up getting the message that success meant getting out. So it's exactly what I did when I was 18, ready to go to college, I got out. And over time, as I met other people from our hometown who had dispersed around the country, and you catch up over a beer or a cup of coffee, the conversation more and more started turning to home, and we began to realize that we had this relationship, like it mattered that we were from somewhere in a way that we didn't understand when we were growing up. But you understand when you leave, you go somewhere else, you realize you're the product of a culture. and that you have a relationship to that place.
Yeah. And where, for you, do you find love in South Bend, or where?
I found love online.
Oh, swipe right. There you go.
So the thing is, as you may know, I came out relatively late in life. It was after my deployment to Afghanistan. I just thought, you know what, I'm never gonna again be in a situation where I could lose my life, be a grown man in a position of responsibility, and have no idea what it's like to be in love.
Yeah.
So. So I said, if I come home okay, I'm going to figure out how to do this. So I came home, I came out, and I was like, okay, how am I supposed to date?
Yeah.
Because I'm the mayor.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Do you put out procurement? Is that
I live in Indiana, and it's kind of an ethical minefield. Like if you invite somebody to get a cup of coffee and you meet it socially and they think you want to talk to them about something they're working on already, you got to be careful with that. Plus, the community, it's a sizable city, it's not that big, and that all these people, especially like some of these like various city fathers, kind of leading figures in the city, who for years have been putting a lot of effort into trying to introduce me to their daughters. And, barking up the wrong tree. And they were nowhere when I came out. I was like, one of you must have a nephew or something. So I thought, well, I'm a millennial. Let's do. So there's this app called Hinge. It's supposed to talk to your Facebook profile, and I set it for Chicago because that way it'd be kind of. Then I was like, well, I don't want to trick people, so I should make it obvious that I'm a mayor, but I shouldn't be like, mayor looking for a date. So I kind of made sure one of the photos in the profile kind of made it sort of obvious as somebody who would look me up.
Yeah.
And then I find this guy. We click on each other, hit the right hand button, and convinced him to come out for a date. We went to a baseball game, South Bend Cubs.
Oh, nice.
Playing against the Great Lake Loons. There's nothing like 1A baseball in India. And
can't wait for you to tell this love story to your children.
Yeah.
This is really deep. I like it.
And the rest is history, obviously.
Yeah. What do y'all fight about most?
Ooh.
What's the...
we're like any married couple. I don't know, chores.
Yeah.
We have a different philosophy of laundry. I believe that doing the laundry consists of not just putting it in the machine and moving it to the other machine, but actually folding the laundry, putting laundry away. And,
you really are Leonardo.
he believes that if I am awake and the dogs are awake, then I can feed the dogs, even if it's normally his job to feed the dogs. So there's a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's good. I love that. We're so happy to have you in this city, and I think there's so many interesting intersections between the city that you come from and the city that I come from.
Yeah.
In Atlanta, we really are a tale of two cities. Because on one hand, this is the greatest city in the world. It is a place where it is a place where innovation, entrepreneurship, businesses, social movements, they all got their seed here, right? And that's so important to us. But on the flip side, Atlanta today is also the most unequal city in the United States.
Right.
And inequality turns us into this tale of two cities where, it's confusing. You want to root for your city, but you're also extremely concerned that it's leaving a lot of people behind. And with income inequality, you're rooting for the success, the things that are getting better, but also by nature of how inequality works, a ton of people are left behind.
Right.
That's not too dissimilar to South Bend.
That's right.
So how does a president engage with mayors or local people, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah.
How do you deal with inequality so that the bubble doesn't pop,
Right.
and you get to say, well, it's no longer my problem. They've had to move to another city,
Right.
so here I am, right?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, this rhymes so much with our experience in South Bend, and it's especially true when you're a mayor, right? Because it means it's your job to root for the city and cheerlead for the city and celebrate its successes. And I'm proud of the fact that the city's growing in a way that hasn't happened in a long time, and I think it's a wonderful place. But also when you're mayor, you're responsible for the problems. And we are a community that is growing at a pace that we haven't in a very long time. But we're also a city where not only is there a 25% poverty rate, that's similar to Atlanta, but that's more like 40% for black residents. And that's just officially the federal poverty line, right? We know that that understates how many people are in distress. And so we see that inequality playing out. I think that a lot of it you can get traction on at the local level through local leadership. And we sought to lift up minority entrepreneurs. We've sought to invest in neighborhoods that were underinvested in. We sought to clear away some of the obstacles to people being able to live a good life. We're trying to make sure that every child in the city is within 10 minutes of being able to walk to a park or recreational facility. We're trying to make sure that we direct dollars into the places where they're needed. But the reality is we need a federal engine to deal with a lot of these things. And some of it is extremely simple, like the minimum wage should be much higher, right? And so I don't want to sound simple-minded, but some of this stuff really isn't that complicated. Other parts of it are, right? So as we think, for example, about the way we're getting ready for automation, what we're finding is that automation and the so-called new machine age and all the things happening in our economy could stand to further deepen the patterns of inequality that we're seeing around us. A good example is the replacement of jobs with gigs, and the fact that there's this cliff if you don't have a full-time job, or if you're considered a contractor instead of a worker, which is more and more a distinction without a difference from the worker's perspective. But if you're a contractor, you don't get the same kind of protections or the same kind of pay or the same kind of benefits. As we move toward the gig economy, that's going to define certainly how people our generation or younger, so many of them participate in the economy. We've got to recognize that it also threatens to deepen inequality for those who don't have access to careers, only gigs.
So when you're running a city, right, and this happens in Atlanta as well, why do we keep using the same financial incentives? And why are we so shocked that we keep getting the same results? Because a lot of the neighborhoods that are in South Bend, unfortunately, they look the same under Obama and 45, right? And there's a lot of neighborhoods here in Atlanta look the same. They haven't had change.
Yeah.
And oftentimes what cities and mayors will say and government leaders will say is the incentive mechanism we're going to use is we're going to incentivize corporations to come in, they'll create jobs, and time again, every report shows us that doesn't work.
Yeah.
But that is a method that's been deployed here, it's a method that's been deployed in South Bend. What is it about providing incentives to corporations in hopes that it will lead to change?
Yeah.
How do we disincentivize something that's not working? Because you're a data guy,
right.
The data's telling us it's not working. How do
Yeah,
we
I mean, for us, I think what we've got to do is we've got to say if we're putting public dollars into something, whether it's an actual cash outlay or whether it's something like a tax break, what is the public buying for that? Are you just buying jobs? Is it worth buying the jobs? Are you buying a good look for the mayor because the company moved there? What we're finding is if a public incentive makes the difference between something being a bad business decision and a good business decision, then you're probably getting companies that aren't that sticky anyway. The other thing that we find is, if we have somebody making a decision about where to move a company, for example, if it's gotten to the point where they're meeting me and going to a couple other cities and meeting a couple other mayors, that means they've already done the math around land, labor, utilities, taxes, whatever. And what they're really there to see is what kind of community is this? Companies are made of people. They're saying, all right, is this where I want to live? Is this where I can hire people? Is this where my family, my employees' families are going to thrive? And it turns out that depends largely on things like schools, infrastructure, safety, culture, all the things that we might be taking money away from if we're plowing it too much into incentives. Now, they do have a place. I mean, we've used them to break a tie on if I really need to get some investment into a certain neighborhood or get downtown back to life, which is an issue in South Bend. And there's just no way it'll pencil out to build, residential property, let alone affordable residential property there without us getting involved. Fine, but you have to know what public benefit you're getting. And for us, we set a admittedly kind of arbitrary goal, but I just said, well, we're not going to let more than $1 go into every 5 private dollars coming to us, because if so, it's just too risky that we might never see the payback come to the taxpayer.
So what should the public expect if the deal doesn't work out, or they get a lemon of a deal, right? So imagine you have a development project called the mulch, right? And so imagine there's a big hole in the floor, and you want to make it better, right? Because it's an important part of the city, and it has history and all of that, and you want to drive it, you want to see it be good, but you're also really, really worried about the residents that have been there for generation after generation after generation, that there's the potential that they can no longer live where they've wanted to live. And when we come up with the incentive structures, it usually favors the corporation. What is the role, and does the federal government have any mechanisms where it could mandate stronger public participation in deals that affect people's lives for generations to come? What does that look like under your administration?
Here's something we can do. I mean, there's a lot of funds that flow to cities in the form of CDBG, right? Community Development Block Grant.
Yeah.
And as a mayor, I suppose I like there being as few strings as possible attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine if there were a requirement, or even just a bonus, that said, okay, if these dollars are going to go into an area where there's some fear or risk of displacement, then the funds need to be dispersed by an entity that has adequate, strong, empowered representation from the original residents of that neighborhood on the body that's going to have say on how the dollars are spent. You do that pretty quickly, you're going to find the decisions are made a little bit differently. And I think there are a lot of things we can do like that with federal resources to guide. Cities can figure it out in their own way. You know, what works in one community is different than another, even from one side of a community to another. I mean, we've got, you know, for us, the area immediately around Notre Dame is where I'm worried about gentrification, because there are these game day houses that are kind of driving values through the roof. On the west side, some people hear about gentrification and they're worried it's coming to them. But the biggest problem we have there is that a very good house is maybe $30,000 and nobody wants to give a loan on it, and nobody will even try to build on the vacant lot next door for 20 years. So it's a different set of problems. But that's exactly why, across the flexibility of federal funds going to local governments, you know, we could establish certain principles, certain left and right boundaries that say, here are the things we want to make sure don't happen as a consequence of this support.
So in Atlanta, we have, in 1974, the first black mayor of this city, Maynard Jackson, created a system called the neighborhood planning units. And it was actually because, you know, Lyndon Johnson, you know, had passed through getting cities to start to take charge as they're doing infrastructure projects. They wanted to incentivize lower income and people of color to be at the table, specifically black people, to have a seat at the table for how decisions would be made about projects and things that would happen in their own neighborhood. So cities around the country have these types of vehicles. And they used to actually be quite strong and would have staffing and support. But if you look over the past 30, 40 years, these neighborhood empowerment systems have been totally undervalued. They're not seen, they're not heard. Yet states and cities continue to get federal incentives that, oh, you engaged with the community where there were 6 people at that? Awesome, checkbox, here's the check. How do we make it so that public participation actually there are more people in this room right now than voted in the District 3 elections in Atlanta. We had probably about, it was around 30% of the city when we had a mayoral race. Only 30% of people voted. And this is not just Atlanta, it's around the country. People have lost trust and faith in government. They don't want to participate. So what incentives do we provide to show people we're not just asking you to have a seat at the table, but we're also not going to put you on the menu? How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is, as you said, if it's just a checklist, then it becomes way too easy, right, to work through that. So, you know, in the same way that a lot of cities that do zoning reform are now looking at form-based codes, where they essentially provide a kind of code book of what we want to encourage, instead of a bunch of rules on don't do this, don't do that. I think there's a way we could have public participation framed in a way that's much more empowering than if we just make it kind of a checklist. And there's going to be some risk in this, right? So when you do participatory budgeting, especially in the first instance,
something we're thinking about here in Atlanta,
you may get some weird outcomes early on, because part of what you're doing is you're actually creating the capacity in the community to make decisions for themselves. And so you have to be willing to tolerate, it's essentially a question of political will. You have to be willing to tolerate some federally funded projects that are going to look funny or be maybe not work out in order to build the kind of capacity that allows communities to make better decisions. The other thing, in 2019, your willingness to show up physically at a zoning meeting or a council meeting should not be the only marker of whether your voice is heard.
That's right.
There's incredible selection bias. For one thing, it's certainly biased against low-income people and shift workers, and so there are more and more interesting ideas being circulated around, providing childcare at public meetings, digital means for participation, not just checking comments section replies, but authentically engaging people's voices digitally. And we don't have it figured out, right? It's in its infancy, but we've got to be doing better than we are now.
And when it comes to public participation, unfortunately, the people who are often that have the hardest time to be there, as you said, are people who might be working 2-3 jobs or whatever. And unfortunately, those types of economic circumstances disproportionately affect people of color, and particularly Black families. And we almost, because we use data sometimes to say, well, whoever was in the room, that's what matters, we leave out so many voices. So being a data-driven public servant, how do you make sure that we don't turn people into data points? That we actually make sure that rooms are actually very representative? And also, when it comes to conversations like this, I mean, you're in Atlanta. We should have a lot of Black people in this room, right? But how do we convince people of color that your campaign is one that's going to actually represent my voice, even though you don't look like me?
Right. Well, first of all, we've got to build trust at lightning speed, which is not how it usually works.
That's
right? I mean, in South Bend, it took years to get. Some people took a chance on me in the first election, but to get the minority support we got in my second election was years of the pastor who says before the election, "Look, I'm onto you because everybody knows how to come to my church before the election," and having that pastor see me come time and time again after the election, right? And it's not just going to the church and talking at people, right? It's that authentic encounter, especially tackling very difficult issues together, that we use. It's the quantity time that we use to build up trust. In a primary election process, we've got to do that much more quickly. And the only real way to do it is to invite people of color, people on the margins, people outside the conversation, not only to say, I hope you support the campaign, but to say, how would you like to shape the campaign? It's got to be an opportunity to impact our conversation. And so there are ways we do that just in terms of how my time is allocated, making sure that we're meeting with activists separate from the big event, separate from the media hit, and we're getting more and more traction as we do that in the cities we go to. But it's also using, again, digital tools to some extent, storytelling tools to some extent, to invite people to shape the campaign so that we are strategically living the values that we want to enact. And then part of it's just making clear what our agenda is, especially for Black Americans who need to hear more than a rising tide lifts all boats, and you're going to be fine if you let me grow the economy, because that's what we've been told for 40 years, right? They need to hear more than, our policies won't be racist.